Hey, good morning. Make sure everything works here. So happy to be here. I'm not a botanist or a taxonomist, so I appreciate the opportunity. I'm a fire ecologist, although I did take plant tax in grad school from Mike Messler at Humboldt State years ago, so that was one of my favorite courses. So I caught about 50% of some of the earlier talks. With that said, we're going to be talking about the Carr Fire today. One of the primary topics I worked on in my career is wildland fire management, and specifically fuels management. In the fire triangle, fuels tend to be the thing in the short term that we can manage, that we can change, and so it's a lot of what I do. To give a little bit of context before we dive into the Carr Fire, just some statistics on national acreages. We've had some big years in the recent past. 2015 and 2017, we had about 10 million acres burned. The Carr Fire occurred in 2018, and so it was above average in terms of the 5 and 10 year averages. But the trend seems to be increasing. I think what's actually pretty phenomenal is if you look at the costs just on federal wildland fires. Prior to 2000, we spent about less than $1 billion. 2015 was the first time we spent $2 billion nationally, and 2018 was the first time we hit $3 billion. So that's an increasing trend, and that doesn't account for CAL FIRE in the state of California, just federal trends. And then if we look at the 2018 season, under which the Camp Fire and the Carr Fire and the Woolsey Fire burned, those are just 3 on the top 20 list of CAL FIRE's most deadly and destructive wildfires. 2017 had another 5 of those in the top 20. So working in wildland fire right now, it does seem to be that things are changing. We're on a trajectory that's maybe not so good. But we're not helpless. There's some things we can do, and fuels management is really where we get there. So given that it's not a fire crowd, I just wanted to give some definitions for fuels treatments. So when I'm talking about fuels, I'm talking thinning and forested ecosystems, prescribed burning, broadcast or pile burning, brush removal, mastication, cutting, burning, etc., mowing, some combination of those factors, grazing sometimes. And just so you know, effectiveness monitoring is a requirement for the federal agencies. So if we have a wildland fire impact of fuels treatment, we're required to go out and monitor effectiveness. And all those data are publicly available on the IFTDIS site. But essentially, fuels treatments are designed to reduce fuel availability for wildland fires, right? So we're talking surface, ladder, ground fuels, and often there's a restoration objective as well. More so in the forested ecosystem, sometimes in the shrubland ecosystems, there's type conversion issues. But I don't think we're always totally on point, at least in terms of federal wildland fire managers and how we discuss fuels treatments. I think there's some misconceptions out there about the objectives and the effectiveness, and so I wanted to go over a few points that I think are important. For one is fuels treatments provide operational opportunities during wildland fires. So these are areas where likely the fire intensity, rate of spread, and severity might be reduced. Those are potential opportunities for firefighters to get in there and do some good work, whether that's a burnout operation or protecting your home. But they're not designed to function under extreme conditions, generally speaking. The Carr Fire, a good example. It was plume dominated. It spotted across Whiskeytown Lake in one area near Oak Bottom. Under those extreme conditions, there's not much you can do except get people out of the way. And so designing fuels treatments for that 97th percentile and above, you're often going to have some negative unintended consequences on your native vegetation. We don't do a whole lot of that. They're also not designed to stop fires without intervention, right? So most fuels treatments are not paved parking lots, especially on our wildlands. And so these are areas with reduced fire potential. But if no one's there to help slow that fire, put a line in, utilize that treatment, a fire is going to continue to burn through there most likely in all likelihood. There still may be some benefits in terms of reductions in rate of spread and severity and things like that. So the Carr Fire, I really think, is a window into the future in wildland fire in the state. We're seeing more fires like this, like the Camp Fire. And so some of these misconceptions about fuels treatment effectiveness and the roles of fuels treatments can just kind of muddy the waters, especially in terms of public perception. And I've heard some comments about the Carr Fire that none of the fuels treatments were effective. And so I've had to get up here in a few different contexts and actually talk about, well, some were and some weren't, and some were overpowered. So just to give a brief history of the Carr Fire itself, so it started July 23rd. We had a pretty aggressive initial attack. Dozers were launched immediately. Fire resources weren't limited at that time. Late July 2018 wasn't that busy in the North Ops region. And so there was a perception that we were probably going to get around this thing. Of course, that's not what happened. If we look at the fire progression map, it burned for about 3 days up here, up toward Mary Mountain. And then the 26th was the first big blow-up day. And so in about 3 days, it burned through about 31,000 acres of Whiskeytown National Recreation Area, about 75% of the park. That first night of the 26th, it burned into Old Shasta, West Redding, really destructive PTSD type wildland fire scenario. Spotted across the lake over here, and on the 27th, it burned all the way up to Shasta Valley, about 4 miles. And then the next day, connected the dots between that Shasta Divide and Shasta Valley. So 3 big runs. Under those conditions, you generally aren't expecting fuels treatments to be all that effective. And then just some statistics. So 8th most destructive, ultimately 229,000 acres, so pretty large footprint on the landscape. And pretty damaging too. You know, it wasn't just way out in the wildlands. This was an area with a lot of values at risk in our urban interface. 1,600 structures, 8 fatalities, and significant long-term impacts to the National Park Service unit, Whiskeytown, and the surrounding community. So I alluded to some factors that maybe could potentially limit the effectiveness of fuels treatments. I want to get a little more into that. So one is that the park burned in 3 burn periods, right? Plume-dominated fire behavior, pretty extreme conditions. We were around the 90th percentile for some of the metrics of fire danger. If we look at where firefighting resources were focused, as soon as it blew up into West Redding and Old Shasta, life and property and infrastructure are the primary focus for firefighting efforts, and so that's where a lot of the resources were going. And so the backcountry of Whiskeytown, it's not that there was no one there, but it wasn't a priority at the time of the blow-up. So a lot of that just kind of burned freely through that area. Another important point is that it was a human ignition from the bottom of the slope on Highway 299. If you know anything about fire behavior, they build momentum burning up slope, they preheat fuels. And so it was much different than, say, the 2008 fire season, if some of you remember that, where we had lightning on Shasta Valley that slowly backed down, and we were able to hold it mid-slope on this Boulder Creek Road, where we've done some treatment since then. So very different. We have a fire at the bottom of the slope burning up in terms of momentum. This is the overall severity map. There's a lot of red on that, as you know if you've driven through 299. You know, these lower elevation shrublands and foothill woodlands, those areas, some of them historically burned pretty hot, especially the shrub-dominated areas, and so that red's to be expected. And then you have some real nice mixed conifer and black oak, and then up into the montane forest that burned really hot, and probably hotter than it did historically, generally speaking, because we have some cool fire history studies up here that have looked at tree rings and seen 4 to 8 year fire intervals. So pretty hot fire, about 55% high severity. I want to go through 4 different little case studies where we're starting to do some monitoring work. I have a research project with USGS looking at fuels treatment effectiveness. But the first unit is an area that we thinned in 2013, and this is called the Boulder Creek Thinning Unit. We had a little bit of follow-up pile burning, but not a lot of surface fuel treatment other than the thinning. So the actual treatment we did, the stand density was about 273 trees per acre. We reduced it to 65 trees per acre after our thinning treatment. I had 10 plots in there. Right now, post-Carr Fire, we're looking at less than 1 live tree per acre, unfortunately. This was a significant loss for the park. It's an area that had some really high value mature black oak, mixed conifer, ponderous pine. So this is a post-treatment photo. The next year we came in and did some pile burning, reduced that surface fuel, but we didn't do any broadcast burning in here. And the neat thing about this treatment is that you can see on the left side of the screen, the fire came up off of Whiskeytown Lake. It was a crown fire. It hit the treated stand, and you can see the needles are still intact, but they're all scorched. So that's why most of these trees are dying. But it did transition from a crown fire to a surface fire through that treatment. Again, no one there to hold it or stop it, went through it, and then picked back up and raced to the top of Shasta Valley. So there were some treatment effects, and you can see that here with much less crowns intact, more crowns over here. But still pretty significant heat blasts that cooked a lot of those trees. We've got some, just to zoom in on the severity image, these are these treatment polygons. So you can see it's a little bit more moderate severity in those treatment footprints, but just red on both sides, right? So it pretty much blasted it with heat from both sides. And then we had some neat post-fire ortho photos flown, and you can see where the trees are remaining. But again, a lot of those trees are going to die because they're red. All right, next area, Brandy Creek Thin and Burn. So this was another thinning treatment, I think in 2010, and then we did some follow-up prescribed fire in that thinning area in 2015 and 2017. So 1 year after, or 1 year before the Carr Fire. This was the thinning treatment right here in terms of tree density from 364 down to about 166 trees per acre on average. And then this was the prescribed burn. We reduced it a little bit after that, but mostly just treated the surface fuel. And then post-Carr Fire, we still had about 122 live trees per acre in there. So that prescribed fire the year before seemed to have a pretty beneficial effect. This is just what the stand generally looked like pre-Carr Fire. And then the severity imagery. There's definitely some confounding factors with creeks through here, but you can see these polygons are pretty green compared to the surrounding area. Again, those have been thinned and burned, and they definitely stand out on the aerial imagery. So I think that's an important point, that if you can utilize prescribed fire as a follow-up to your thinning treatments, it's really the only thing that actually reduces those surface fuels. Comparing Brandy to Boulder Creek is a pretty good example of that. If you zoom in on the sugar pine, there was a little spot fire that blew into this stand, and you can tell it just went out on its own, didn't go anywhere during the Carr Fire. I took that photo, so that was kind of cool. All right, next example is the Coggins Park area. So this is up mixed conifer, 4,000 feet elevation. It's the county line road, the western boundary of Whiskeytown National Recreation Area. And we've got some long-term monitoring plots in here. There were some burn treatments that occurred in the mid-90s, and then we've been coming in through fire management and re-burning those with prescribed fire over the last 5 to 8 years. So just the general tree density from those plots across the treatments, about 91 to 240 trees per acre after our prescribed fires. Pretty mixed effects up there. Definitely some areas that burn hot. There are only about 20 live trees per acre, and other areas that retain some, but it didn't burn quite as hot as a lot of the surrounding areas within our treatments. We've got some long-term photo points. So this is after our 2013 prescribed burn, so left is pre-treatment, right is post-treatment. So these were pretty good prescribed burns in terms of fuels treatment effectiveness. You can see a lot of the shrubs were reduced. There was fuel consumption. It wasn't a wet burn. It was a fairly warm prescribed fire. If you look at some of these same sites post-Carr Fire, so again it's paired left to right. Some tree survival in some areas burned hot in others. And then there's some of these open sandy sites that barely carry fire at all, and the canopy's mostly intact. So pretty mixed effects, but when you zoom out and look at the aerial imagery and the severity maps, there's some pretty cool boundaries between the treated and untreated over here in this area, and then adjacent areas that burn pretty hot. But the important point up here is that there were 2 burns in here, so 97 and 2015, a 2016 burn right here, so fairly recent prescribed fire entries prior to that Carr Fire. All right, last example is moving downslope closer to the Shasta Divide, Mule Mountain area. This is kind of mixed shrub, non-cone live oak, around 1,000-foot elevation. And so this is an area on the eastern boundary of the park where we did some prescribed fire treatments in the mid-2000s. And then in 2017 and 2018, we came in and burned this hole, reburned some of these pieces, but actually spring of 2018, we burned a couple units, so just a few months, or maybe 2 months prior to the Carr Fire. Generally, this is what that spring burn looked like. So the heavy fuels on the ground, the logs still retained some moisture, didn't have a huge amount of fuel consumption in those, But a lot of the fine fuels definitely took a punch out of that, reduced some of the stand density in here, and just pre-fire image. When you look at the post-fire imagery following the car, it pretty much went around this side. It did spot and burn through here, but when you look at that severity footprint and the retaining green, it's pretty impressive how much was retained in that. Now granted, that was burned in 2018 right before the car, so hopefully it would be effective, right? Not a real long timeline. So just to wrap up with some key points that I see in terms of learning from this event, at least in the initial years after. Treatments can definitely be effective, but they have pretty short lifespans. And it depends on the fuel and the vegetation type, but 5 years is kind of about what I'm observing in terms of treatment effectiveness. The forested ecosystems maybe a little bit longer where there's more canopy cover, but it's not a real long time frame. Big picture at Whiskeytown, areas that included prescribed fire following thinning seem to do quite a bit better, especially recent burns, because again, it's the only thing that really consumes those surface fuels. Areas with multiple treatments up in that county line, Coggins Park area up here, and east boundary, they seem to do a little bit better because they had 2 burns. So you have to build a fuels program, right? These aren't one-time treatments. We've got 60 inches of rain annually in Whiskeytown. There's lots of potential for growth. Fuel grows every year. You can't walk away from this stuff. Because of that, you need to focus where it counts. I think some of the crown fire adapted ecosystems, the knobgum pine, the shrubs, they're a little more challenging to manage fuels in. I think defensible space is critical in those areas. But if you go in and burn those every 2 to 5 years, you're going to type convert them, right? There's going to be some unintended consequences. So it really depends where your values at risk are, your infrastructure, buffering out those areas, and then trying to really utilize that historic fire regime if you want to maintain the native vegetation. Strategic treatments create opportunities, but may not always be utilized due to complex wildland fire environments. That's kind of big picture for me at Whiskeytown. A lot of treatments, the fire just burned through. On any other day, smaller fire, less extreme conditions, you probably could have utilized some of those to hold that same fire like we did in 2008 on the Shasta Valley side of the lake. But given the complexity of West Reading on fire, the values at risk, the prioritization process, that's just not how it played out. But I don't think that's a good justification to not do anything, because on a lot of other time periods it would have had some more effectiveness. And just to close, the trend is severe fires are going to reoccur. We're seeing that. We may have, a few annual periods where we don't have extreme fires occurring, but most likely with climate change, the evidence suggests we're going to see more of this. So fuels are the primary thing we can influence in the short term. That's what I focus on, and we try to be cognizant of that natural role of fire, but there's not a lot else we can do. And so I'm optimistic following the Carr Fire, just because some of these sites, it appeared that it just nuked and everything burned off, but there actually was some treatment effectiveness in some of these sites, and so that gives me a little more confidence in these treatments. But you got to understand they're not always going to work, and if there's no people there, the fire is just going to burn through them. So with that, open it up for questions.